For today's Sunday video, we're doing two things. Continuing with German ships after Gneisenau last weekend, and returning to where this little series of salvage videos first began, at Scapa Flow with the High Seas Fleet. In this case, SMS Derfflinger, the last of the major wrecks to be fully salvaged. This ship is pretty well known, mostly for the massive pounding she endured at the Battle of Jutland, and the resulting nickname of Iron Dog. Ultimately, however, her fate would be the same as many others, scuttled at Scapa Flow to prevent anyone from making use of her, where the ship would finally be raised in 1939 at the dawn of the Second World War. Let's look at that story now, beginning, of course, with the sinking. This is a well-known story if you study naval history. After the conclusion of the Great War, the High Seas Fleet was interned at the British naval base of Scapa Flow. There it would remain as treaty negotiations went on at Versailles. Exactly what the fate of the fleet would have been is something of an open question. The British, for their part, didn't really want anyone to have the ships, not even their ostensible allies in France or Italy, because such a powerful fleet would upset the balance of power and not in their favor. Nonetheless, the German admiral, Ludwig von Reuter, came to believe the British intended to seize the High Seas Fleet. Although there is conflicting information here, you'll see it said that he was resigned to giving up the fleet, provided the German government agreed to it. You'll also see people claim he was under orders to scuttle the ships, if the British even sneezed in the direction of seizing the fleet. It doesn't really matter too much in the long run. Reuter apparently read a newspaper indicating the armistice expired at noon on June 21st of 1919. Accordingly, plans were put in place to scuttle the fleet. The German crews had drilled for this and were efficient in their work. Within a couple hours, on June 21st, much of the High Seas Fleet was on the bottom. Derfflinger was one of those, rolling over and capsizing in relatively deep water. The view of her sinking is one of the most distinctive of the entire scuttling, with good reason. That said, after she sank, Derfflinger was largely left alone. Over the 1920s and 1930s, much of the High Seas Fleet was salvaged, including her own sister Hindenburg, which, as stated, I've covered before. Derfflinger was not, at least not until the very end of the 1930s. She was considered one of the more difficult wrecks to raise, due in large part to her depth. By the standards of the Scapa Flow wrecks, this was quite deep. As a result, when Ernst Cox was salvaging wrecks, he made no effort to move this one. That would be up to his successor and former subordinate, Thomas Mackenzie, who took over for Cox after 1932. He would salvage several battleships, including SMS Bayern. However, for today, we'll focus on Derfflinger, a wreck that even an experienced diver and salvager like Mackenzie considered almost too dangerous. The wreck was over 140 feet below the surface, on the very edge of safe diving distance, especially for 1939, when this work began. Divers could only spend a single hour on the wreck instead of the more usual 8, and after that hour, they had to spend 90 minutes decompressing. It was risky, dangerous business, diving into the dark depths of a deep wreck with 1930s technology. Nonetheless, the work would proceed. Divers descended through massive dive trunks down into the wreck. They would have to clear out decades of muck and debris to find and seal holes. This work would have been aided at least a little by experience on Hindenburg. If nothing else, they had an idea where to look for the places to seal, with the important note that Hindenburg had sunk up right while Derfflinger was capsized. Eventually, this process concluded enough to raise the hulk. Compressed air was pumped in, and Derfflinger came roaring to the surface on August 3rd of 1939, the last of the major Scapa Flow wrecks to be raised, both because the other wrecks were too deep and because, well, note that date. As Mackenzie and his men congratulated themselves on a good job, Europe was less than a month away from war. Derfflinger was prepped for a voyage to scrapping that wouldn't come. Instead, she was anchored in Scapa Flow, where the overturned wreck remained throughout the Second World War. She would only be sent off to scrapping in 1948, where the wreck was taken apart next to HMS Iron Duke. Two old rivals ending their lives beside each other after 2 world wars, with Derfflinger having the unfortunate distinction of being afloat upside down longer than she was afloat upright. With all of that said, however, let's look at the wreck now. We can start here with the ship getting blown out of the water. Quite literally, though not in the usual usage of that phrase. It's interesting to me because most of the pictures of these salvages aren't quite so dramatic. Compared to the Hindenburg video, for example, where the most dramatic thing was the storms. Here we can see Derfflinger's bow, with the salvage equipment standing tall over her wreck as it leaps out of the water. I don't think seeing a battlecruiser surface like a submarine or a whale is something you see very often. But it's what we have here, complete with the air being blown out of the wreck, and the water shooting out by the bow. Of course, most of the hulk is still underwater at this point, so there's only one real note to make on that topic, and that's the bow torpedo tube, visible here, a distinctive design choice on German Glosserkreuzer. Once on the surface, Derfflinger was moved to rest upside down. We don't really have any pictures I can confirm from this period. So instead, let's look at when she was put in a floating dry dock. You can see her here in the early stages of the process, although this image only really shows the extreme stern, where all 4 props, or screws, are still in place, a bit pitted from their time underwater, but otherwise intact. The same goes for the rudder and what we can see of the hull. The next picture, meanwhile, is from roughly the same position, just from a different angle, and apparently from aboard the floating dock. It would appear this was taken when Derfflinger was first being towed in, judging from the position. And the tugboats visible towards the bow. That too. Unfortunately, the quality of the picture is fairly rough. Not surprising, but still unfortunate. We can only really make out the rudder and the props, and even then it's not terribly clear. On the other hand, it is possible to see the rest of the hull further up. Not really any detail, but then again, there wouldn't be much detail to begin with. Either way, we have one more image from this stage. This one from aboard the wreck, presumably on the rudder. There's 2 interesting things here. First, the prop in the foreground. Those were visibly pitted in the earlier image. Here, from up close, that pitting is even more apparent. These are in rough shape. That said, the prop shafts seem fine, at least the one we can see here. The other thing of note, meanwhile, is the man standing on the wreck. This makes for a good indication of scale. Derfflinger was relatively small in comparison to something like Tirpitz. But even overturned like this, the wreck is still quite large. Beyond that, there's not much to say. We can see more tugs and equipment on the ship, but that's about it. Judging from the lack of the dry dock, this must have been taken right after she surfaced, making this the earliest of the pictures outside of that surfacing itself. After this, we have one last picture of the wreck in the water, apparently taken in 1946, just before the hulk was pulled out of the water to be towed off. You can see the props, which seem to be in better shape. Presumably they were cleaned at some point. There's also buildings on the top, which we'll see better later on. As for the pipes, I believe those are to supply air to men working inside the wreck, although I'm not sure. As for the next couple pictures, these were taken much later on, after the wreck had been raised into dry dock. We've got this one, for example, where you have Derfflinger high and dry being towed off to scrapping. Interestingly, you can still see the paint line between the above water part and the anti-fouling paint on the underside. Whether that's the original German paint or something the British added during her time afloat isn't entirely clear. Regardless, there's still not much to see on the wreck itself. The bow torpedo tube is more visible here, and there's buildings built atop her wreck to house workers. Other than that, not much to say, although just the image of an overturned battlecruiser being towed off for scrapping is still an interesting one. The next image for its part is from the stern. The same story still applies here. There's not much detail because of the orientation of the wreck. What this one does well, on the other hand, is the scale. Those tugs, compared to Derfflinger, show the size of the ship rather well. You can also see the stern better here, including where it reaches the deck, although the deck itself isn't visible. And now the final image in this set, the wreck reaching her final destination to be scrapped, mostly notable for being a lower view. We can more clearly see the shape of the bow here. Not much beyond that, however, aside from Iron Duke in the process of her own scrapping in the background. As for Derfflinger scrapping, we have 3 images here. First, this one, a close-in look at the bracing of the hull beneath the stern. This gives us 3 things. First, a look at how much bracing was required to support all that weight. Second, a glimpse at the rough condition of a ship raised after 20 years underwater. And third, another look at the props up towards the top. Now the second image is more interesting, one of the more famous ones as well, because we can see one of the 4 main battery turrets upside down and firmly in place, although there's quite a bit of bracing here. This was clearly taken when the scrapping was well underway. There's ruined metal here where they've been cutting the ship apart. How much is gone and how much is left isn't apparent. It's too close in to say. Nonetheless, it makes for a striking image. The turret's sitting there, crusty and rusted, beneath a partially scrapped hull. As for the last image, that's even further along. By this point, barely anything is left of Derfflinger, just the remnants of a barbette and some of the hull. This is very late into the process when much of the ship was gone. There's not really much to say here, honestly. Just that it's a sad sight to see if you're a fan of Imperial German warships, especially the Große. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.